Hey, this is Professor Homa. Welcome to EX5 CSS. We'll be working with a dentist site this time around, and I actually used My Dentist, and I went to his website and I took some images and I took some information and I put it together, and we're going to basically take all this raw information that I got from his page and we're going to build a nice little home page here. And in the process, we're going to learn how to take unordered lists and turn them into navigation buttons, even with rollovers and different colors and the underlines taken away. So we're going to work with navigation a little bit more. We're going to learn how to float elements, and we already learned how to float an element on our first exercise, the EX4, but not only are we going to float an image element to the right of some copy, but we're also going to float two elements together so they can act like columns on a page. So this navigation, or these navigation buttons, are going to float to the left side of this content here. So it's kind of going to be almost like a two-column layout is what we're going to be doing with floating. And we're going to work more with floating because it can get a little tricky when we start to float things on a page. Also, another thing that we're going to focus on is using IDs. IDs are like first names. They're like specific names for parts of a page. On our first exercise, we worked with like a header element. And we are going to have header elements. Matter of fact, we're going to have two. We're going to have a header element with a picture and a header element with an address. And we're going to use ID names to differentiate them, so that I can have a header with an ID of banner pick, and then a header with an ID of address bar. And then we're going to have a navigation element, and we're going to give them names too. We're going to give them ID names because we have two navigation elements. We have nav on the left side and we have nav on the bottom, and we're going to call them like nav ID equals nav left and nav ID equals nav bottom. We'll differentiate them. So we can have multiple HTML5 elements, but as long as we give them multiple ID names, they could be treated separately. Also, there's a section in the middle here where our body copy is, our heading, some body copy, a picture floated in there. This is kind of our main section. We'll even call that section ID equals main, so we know that's our main section. And then at the bottom, all this will be contained in a footer element. We'll call it footer, but then we'll also have elements inside there, like an ID of copyright and an ID of, actually a nav ID of nav bottom. So we're going to be working with IDs a little more extensively in this, and I still put the drop shadow and border on like we did the other one so that we could kind of review some things we did on our first exercise. But we're going to be putting this all together. And again, this is what the raw HTML will look like. You could see that, here's the header pick, here's the address bar. It's going to start out as a bullet list, and we're going to convert it into navigation buttons. And there's an H1 tag, there's a picture. This is where we're going to use the figure and fig caption like we used in our first exercise. These are just paragraphs. There's another unordered list at the bottom, a bullet list that we're going to convert into navigation. And this time when we do that, we're going to convert it into inline elements so that they're not stacked on top of each other. They're actually side by side, kind of all inside of one paragraph in a way. So we're going to do that. And then we'll also be applying the background colors, the text colors, the padding, which is basically the space that goes around some of these areas. And we're going to be floating this to one side. So a lot of CSS we're going to try and incorporate into this exercise. Now, just to go and look at I'm going to look at our HTML just a little bit here of the last and I'm going to give you this HTML page, but just to show you, there's two header elements. One has an ID of banner pick, and that just has an image in it. And then this is a header with an ID of address bar, and that just has text in it. And notice all these little things in here. Those are the bullet characters that are inside there. And then there's a nav element, nav with an ID of nav left, and that's basically, you could see it's a unordered list, but there are also links on there. We're also going to link them. That's what those arefs are, and we just have blank links right now, just with pound signs. They're kind of dummy links right now. And then moving down, we have our section, and that's where our main body content is. We have, his name. We have a picture in there inside the figure elements, the fig caption, and then we just have a couple paragraphs, and that's all that's in that section. And notice it's not just section, it's section with an ID of main, so that if we had different sections on different pages, they could have different names on them. And then moving down, there's one last element we're going to have as footer, and inside footer we have a nav element with an ID of nav bottom, and then we have just basically a paragraph ID that's called copyright, where we just had a paragraph and we gave it an ID of copyright, just so we could identify it a little bit better through CSS. So when we look at our CSS, we'll go down to the bottom and we'll see that we'll have, a footer copyright. And we'll talk about the way some of these names are set up. Typically when you have an HTML element with an ID name, here's an example right here, the two header ones that are right here. You can see it has header, # banner pick. What that means is this is the element header, and then right up against each other, this means that this is the ID. So this is header with an ID name of banner pick, header with an ID name of address bar. Now that's a little different when you have a space. When you have a space, it means that's inside that. That means inside this ID, there's an unordered list. Or inside this ID, there's a line item. These are kind of like when there is a space, it's kind of like the child element. But when you see them all together, it basically means like last name, first name. And you have to be careful because when there's a space, it means there's another element inside that. And there's some areas down here where you can see it has footer, space. They aren't together because it's not footer with an ID name of copyright. There's actually an ID, a paragraph ID of copyright that's inside footer. So there's a space here to differentiate them, that they're not, copyright isn't the name of footer, it's just basically an ID that's inside footer. So, that'll be something we'll deal with as we work through this. As we get back to this, I just want to review this one last time, just to show you the main structure that we're going to be working with here. There's going to be two header elements. The first one, and I'll draw a little graphic around that, is basically going to be a header with an ID of banner pick. And that's all that's going to be there is the banner pick. So that's one header element. The second header element is going to have an ID of address bar. And that's going to be this little element here that has his name and address and the phone and fax number. So there's a header address bar. This section over here is going to be a nav element. It's going to be nav with an ID of nav left. And this will be a section that will actually have to be floated to the left of its container that it's in, which is the body container, which we'll discuss more about floats. But anyway, this will have to be floated to the left so that these could kind of lay out in two columns. And this is the section with the ID of main that's here. Okay, and this also has an image floated inside it. So this isn't a 3-column layout, it's just 2, but this element is floated in this one section that's here. So this again is the section main. And then at the bottom we have footer with this whole section down here is footer, and we have 2 IDs in there. We basically have a nav element with an ID of nav bottom, and then we have a paragraph ID of copyright, which is also in that footer. And remember, we have the whole body element, which has a background. I think we give it a background color, this off-white for the body. Remember, the body is also centered in our page. If we move this around, just like the last one we did, we're using a margin 0 auto, which means auto means there's automatic space on either side. Whatever the width is, if this is 960, whatever leftover space is there, it'll create the same automatic amount on either side, and it gives the impression basically of it being centered, until it gets to the point where it's too small. Okay, so we're going to do that like we did with the first exercise. Something different, we can use the HTML element to give a background color, this real light blue, that goes behind everything else. So our body would be everything in here, but HTML would be everything outside of that in the browser window. So we'll give a property or a value of a background color for that as well. And we still use the drop shadow and the little border on that. So that's pretty much what we'll be doing, and I'm going to be going through the HTML and the CSS and explaining some things as we go. Some of these parts are going to be a little longer, so we may have a whole video just on doing these things, because these things take a little longer with the CSS. Floats take a little longer. So some of the things will take a little bit longer, and I'll give you some other videos to look at regarding floats as we work through this. But this is just a little overview, again, for EX5 Dentist. I'll call it that. EX5 CSS Dentist.